An Iranian ballistic missile hit the United States military base.
Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps says it has launched a large-scale attack on U.S. military bases
at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, at 0247 local time, Senior Airman Danielle Royce heard that sound for the first time in her life. She had been 19 months into her deployment with the 379th Air Expeditionary Wing. She had processed over 4,000 logistics manifests. She had never once considered the possibility that the sky above her could become hostile, because for 2 decades, it hadn't been. The base was 70 miles from the nearest coastline, ringed by Patriot batteries, watched by satellites that could track a baseball at orbital altitude. She was safe. That was not a belief. That was doctrine. And doctrine on this night was about to be tested by someone who had spent 11 years studying exactly how to break it. To understand what happened in the Persian Gulf on this night, you need to understand something that most analysts get wrong about Iran's missile program. The common narrative, the one you hear on cable news, the one that fills most YouTube videos on this subject, is that Iran built missiles because it couldn't build a modern air force. That's true as far as it goes. After the Iran-Iraq War, after watching American air power dismantle Saddam Hussein's military twice, Tehran made a strategic calculation: they could never compete in the air. So they went underground. They carved launch facilities into mountains. They invested in solid fuel propulsion. They built the largest and most diverse ballistic missile arsenal in the Middle East. But here is the part that almost nobody talks about, and it changes the entire strategic picture. Iran didn't just build missiles because they couldn't build jets. They built missiles because missiles solve a problem that jets cannot. A fighter aircraft, no matter how advanced, must take off from a runway that the enemy already knows about. It must fly through airspace that the enemy is already watching. It must survive long enough to deliver its payload. Every step is a chance to be stopped. A ballistic missile, by contrast, can be launched from a camouflaged transporter erector launcher hidden in a valley that didn't exist on any satellite image 6 hours ago. It reaches its target in minutes. And here is the critical insight: if you launch enough of them simultaneously from enough different locations, you don't need any single missile to be unstoppable. You need the salvo to be overwhelming. This is saturation doctrine, and Iran didn't invent it. They perfected it for their specific geography. The Persian Gulf is, from a military standpoint, an absurdly difficult place to defend. It is narrow. Major American installations, Al Udeid in Qatar, Al Dhafra in the UAE, Naval Support Activity Bahrain, Camp Arifjan in Kuwait, sit within a geographic arc that Iranian missile forces can reach in windows ranging from roughly 6 to 12 minutes depending on the system. That is not a lot of time. And the geography compounds the problem. Radar coverage over the Zagros Mountains is complicated by terrain masking. Launch detection from space is reliable, but it tells you a missile is coming, not precisely where it will land until the trajectory stabilizes. And trajectory stabilization, for a modern maneuvering warhead, might not happen until the last 40 seconds of flight. The American defense network in the Gulf was built to handle this. Multiple and /TPY-2 radar arrays feeding data to Patriot PAC-3 batteries, with THAAD systems providing an upper-tier intercept layer, all networked through the Integrated Air and Missile Defense Battle Command System. On paper, it is the most sophisticated missile defense architecture ever deployed in a combat theater. But every system has a design assumption. And the design assumption here was that any Iranian strike would come in a recognizable pattern. A limited volley, politically motivated, telegraphed by days of escalatory rhetoric that would give the defense time to posture. What happened on this night shattered that assumption. The first indication came not from radar, but from satellite. A defense support program bird in geosynchronous orbit detected infrared bloom signatures across western Iran, not one or two, but clusters. The data cascaded into the Joint Tactical Ground Station at Ramstein Air Force Base in Germany and simultaneously to the Forward Missile Defense Element at Al Udeid. Within 90 seconds, the picture began to clarify, and it was a picture that nobody in the room had ever seen in real time. Launches were confirmed from at least 14 separate locations spanning a 700-kilometer front from the Zagros foothills in the north to sites near Bushehr in the south. The missile types, as best as tracking could determine in those first frantic minutes, included Ahmad medium-range ballistic missiles, Desful solid fuel systems, and, most alarmingly, a newer variant that American intelligence had catalogued but never seen fired operationally. The count kept climbing. 40 confirmed tracks. Then 60. Then the number passed 80 and the tracking board at Al Udeid became so saturated with trajectory projections that Sergeant First Class Aaron Kimball, the senior air defense NCO on watch, later said the screen looked like someone had dropped a handful of red spaghetti on a map. 80+ inbound ballistic missiles. 14 launch origins. Targets across 4 countries. This was not a political gesture. This was a military operation. The Patriot batteries activated automatically. The system is designed for exactly this: radar acquisition, track discrimination, threat prioritization, and engagement, all happening in a compressed timeline that no human being could manage through conscious decision-making alone. The PAC-3 missiles, each one a hit-to-kill interceptor that must physically collide with the incoming warhead at closing speeds that can exceed Mach 10, began leaving their canisters in sequence. The sound of a Patriot launch is distinctive, a concussive ripping bark followed by a sustained roar that you feel in your sternum before you hear it in your ears. On this night, that sound came in waves. Battery after battery engaging. But here is where saturation doctrine proves its logic. Each Patriot battery carries a finite number of interceptors. Standard loadout is 16 missiles per launcher, and doctrine typically calls for firing 2 interceptors per incoming threat to achieve acceptable kill probability. Do the math. 16 interceptors. 2 per target. 8 targets per battery before you are empty. And there were more than 80 threats inbound. The THAAD battery at Al Dhafra engaged the higher altitude threats, the ones arcing above the standard Patriot engagement envelope. THAAD interceptors are extraordinary pieces of engineering, destroying targets with kinetic impact alone at altitudes above the atmosphere. They worked. Several incoming warheads broke apart in the upper atmosphere, their debris scattering across harmless trajectories over the Gulf waters. But THAAD is not designed for volume. It is designed for precision against a limited high-value threat set. And what was coming was neither limited nor singular. Danielle Royce felt the first impact before she understood it. The ground shuddered. Not like an earthquake, more like the earth coughing. A deep, percussive thud that transmitted through the concrete floor of the logistics building and into her boots. Then another. Then a sound like a freight train passing directly overhead, except freight trains do not end in a white flash and a pressure wave that cracks the window behind your desk and sends 1,000 pieces of safety glass cascading across your keyboard. The missiles that got through, and some to get through, because that is the mathematical reality of saturation, struck across a spread of targets. Aircraft shelters at Al Udeid took direct hits. The flight line, where KC-135 tankers and reconnaissance aircraft sat in revetments designed to protect against mortar fragments, not ballistic warheads carrying 800 pounds of high explosive, became a landscape of burning aluminum and jet fuel. A barracks complex took a proximity strike, the warhead detonating 40 meters short of the building, close enough to collapse the facing wall and send a shockwave through every room on the ground floor. At Al Dhafra, the impact pattern suggested the Iranians had specifically targeted the hangars housing the F-35A detachment. 2 hangars were struck. A third took damage from fragmentation. The F-35 is arguably the most advanced combat aircraft on the planet, and on this night several of them sat burning in their shelters, not because they had been defeated in the air, but because they had never gotten off the ground. In Bahrain, the naval facility took 3 impacts. 1 struck a support building. 1 struck an open area near the pier. 1 struck the water 200 meters offshore, sending a geyser that was visible from downtown Manama. The port facilities where Fifth Fleet operations were coordinated suffered structural damage. The guided missile destroyer moored pierside had its topside radar arrays damaged by fragmentation, not enough to sink the ship, but enough to render it combat ineffective until repairs could be made. The casualty reports began coming in within minutes, and they told the story of what happens when explosive force meets human fragility. At Al Udeid, the collapsed barracks was the worst single site. Service members who had been sleeping were pulled from rubble, some alive, some not. Medical teams that had trained for mass casualty events were now executing those plans for real, triaging in corridors that still had dust suspended in the air, working by flashlight when the backup generators took 90 seconds to spin up. Dozens of Americans were wounded. Many were fighting for their lives with injuries that reflected the brutal physics of blast and fragmentation, traumatic brain injuries, shrapnel wounds, blast lung. And others did not survive. The numbers were still being counted when the sun came up, but it was already clear this was the deadliest single attack on American military personnel in the Middle East in decades. Not since the Beirut barracks bombing of 1983 had so many Americans been killed in a single hostile action in this part of the world. The parallel was not lost on anyone. But here is the thing about the American military that adversaries consistently misjudge. They see the initial damage and calculate victory. They count destroyed aircraft and collapsed buildings and assume that the equation is complete. What they fail to account for, what they always fail to account for, is what comes after. Within the first hour after impact, while fires were still burning and medevac helicopters were still loading casualties, a very different process was already underway in a command center that had been built specifically to survive exactly this scenario. The Combined Air Operations Center at Al Udeid had been hardened. Its communications redundancy was designed for a degraded environment. And the people inside it, shaken but functioning, were already executing a response plan that had been rehearsed, refined, and held in reserve for precisely the moment when Iran made the strategic miscalculation of believing that a first strike could be decisive. The American response was not impulsive. This is an important distinction. In the popular imagination, retaliation is immediate. A fist swung back in anger. In reality, the response was methodical, and it was methodical because the people planning it understood something that the Iranian leadership apparently did not. You do not get to choose how this ends once you start it. But the other side does. Within 4 hours, B-2 Spirit stealth bombers that had launched from Diego Garcia were over Iranian airspace. The Iranians did not detect them. Their air defense network, a patchwork of Russian-supplied S-300 systems, domestically produced Bavar 373 batteries, and older Hawk and Rapier derivatives, was oriented toward defending against a conventional air campaign. They were looking for formations. They were looking for radar signatures. The B-2 gives you neither. It approaches like a hole in the sky. The first targets were the launch sites. Not all of them. You cannot hit 14 dispersed sites simultaneously. But the fixed infrastructure that supported them, the missile storage facilities buried in the Zagros, the command and control nodes that had coordinated the attack, the transporter erector launcher garrisons. Satellite-guided munitions struck with precision measured in single meters. Underground facilities that Iran had spent decades constructing were penetrated by GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators, 30,000-pound weapons designed for exactly this purpose. Simultaneously, Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from Arleigh Burke-class destroyers in the Arabian Sea and the Mediterranean struck a separate target set: air defense nodes, military communications infrastructure, and Revolutionary Guard command facilities. The Tomahawk is subsonic. It is not fast. But it is precise, it is numerous, and when you fire them from multiple axes simultaneously, the defender's problem is not detecting them. It is prioritizing which ones to try to stop while the others keep coming. Within 12 hours, Iran's integrated air defense network had gaps in it large enough to fly conventional strike packages through. And those packages came: F-15E Strike Eagles, F-16 Fighting Falcons. The surviving F-35s that had been dispersed to alternate airfields under pre-planned force protection protocols. They came in waves, and each wave targeted a layer of Iran's retaliatory capability: remaining missile launchers, fuel storage, military airfields, naval fast attack craft bases along the Gulf Coast. The asymmetry of the response was not cruelty. It was doctrine. The American military does not believe in proportional response in the colloquial sense. It believes in response calibrated to achieve a strategic objective. And the strategic objective here was singular and clear: ensure that Iran could not conduct a second barrage. Within 72 hours, that objective was functionally achieved. Iran's long-range missile capability was degraded to the point where any follow-up strike would be a fraction of the initial barrage. Their air defense network was shattered in the western provinces. Their naval capacity in the Gulf, particularly the fast attack boats that threatened shipping, had been reduced by an estimated 60%. But none of that mathematics, none of that strategic calculus, changes what happened in those first 20 minutes at Al Udeid and Al Dhafra and Bahrain. Danielle Royce survived. She was treated for lacerations and a perforated eardrum. She returned to duty within a week because the logistics manifests did not stop needing processing simply because the building they were processed in now had plywood where glass used to be. She did not talk about the sound for months. When she eventually did, in a phone call to her mother in Dayton, Ohio, she said something that distills this entire scenario into a single human truth. She said, "Mom, the worst part wasn't the explosion. The worst part was the 2 seconds before it, when I knew it was coming and there was nothing I could do." That is the gap. The gap between knowing and acting. The gap between detection and interception. The gap between doctrine and reality. Every piece of military technology, every billions-dollar defense system, every training pipeline, and every readiness inspection exists to close that gap. And on this night, the gap held for most of the threats. The defense worked. The majority of those 80-plus missiles were intercepted or failed in flight. But saturation doctrine does not need most. It needs some. And some got through. And some was enough to kill Americans and change the strategic landscape of the Middle East in a single night. What does this scenario actually tell us? Beyond the drama, beyond the explosions and the acronyms, what is the lesson? It tells us that missile defense is not a shield. It never was. It is a sieve, an extraordinarily sophisticated sieve that catches most of what comes through, but a sieve nonetheless. And anyone who builds policy on the assumption that it is a shield is building on a foundation that will crack the moment an adversary commits to volume over precision. It tells us that forward-deployed forces are hostages to geography. The Gulf is narrow. The bases are known. The flight times are short. These are not secrets. They are features of the map that every Iranian military planner has memorized. The advantage of forward deployment, rapid response, power projection, alliance assurance, must be constantly weighed against the vulnerability it creates. And it tells us something about the nature of escalation that is perhaps the most important lesson of all. The Iranian leadership, in this scenario, calculated that a massive first strike would shock the Americans into negotiation. That the political cost of dead Americans would make Washington reconsider whatever policy had driven the crisis to this point. This is a common miscalculation. It has been made before, by Japan in 1941, by Argentina in 1982, by Saddam Hussein in 1990. The assumption that a dramatic first blow will produce a political outcome rather than a military one. It is an assumption that has been wrong every single time it has been tested against the United States. Because what comes after is not negotiation. What comes after is the full weight of a military that spends more on defense than the next 10 nations combined, operated by people who are very, very good at their jobs and who are now very, very motivated. That is not a policy argument. It is an observation about patterns. And patterns in geopolitics are the closest thing we have to gravity. The people who were at Al Udeid and Al Dhafra and Bahrain on this night, the ones who heard that sound, who felt the ground move, who pulled their friends out of rubble, they are the ones who live inside this equation. They are the variable that no satellite can track and no doctrine can fully account for. They volunteered to stand in the gap. Some of them paid for it. The question this scenario leaves you with is not whether American missile defense works. It works. Imperfectly, under stress, with gaps that adversaries will always try to exploit, but it works. The question is different, and it is harder. The question is, what happens when a determined adversary accepts those losses and launches anyway? What happens when the math says some will get through, and someone signs the order knowing that? What happens in the 2 seconds Danielle Royce described, between knowing and impact, multiplied across every base in the Gulf? That is the question I want you to sit with. Not because there is a comfortable answer, but because there isn't one. And the absence of a comfortable answer is the most honest thing any analyst can offer you. If this kind of analysis, the kind that doesn't pretend the math is clean or the outcomes are certain, is what you come here for, I'd ask you to subscribe. Not because I need the number. Because the next scenario I'm building sits on the other side of this one, and what it reveals about the escalation ladder is something I have not seen anyone else cover. Before you go, though, tell me below, if you're sitting in that command center with 80 tracks inbound and 16 interceptors loaded, how do you prioritize? Who do you protect? The aircraft or the people? There is no right answer. That is exactly the point. Let's talk about it.